If you remember your kitchen smelling like fried squirrel on a Tuesday, neighbors know what you were cooking from Main Street. Welcome home. You lived through the 1970s.
They're looking forward to an important date, dinner at home with the family.
When families cooked roadkill venison and trapped backyard squirrels, meals the FDA later restricted, not because they were dangerous, but because food that costs nothing. So let's discover these 30 banned survival meals that kept families fed during the recession. Walk into a kitchen in rural West Virginia in October 1974 when Mr. James Caldwell hit a 6-point buck on Route 19 at dawn and dragged it home before the state trooper could cite him for illegal possession. The sound was the heavy thud of the carcass hitting his garage floor, and the smell was that mix of cold morning air and fresh blood that told you this wasn't store-bought. By noon, his wife Martha had the hindquarters in a cast-iron pot with potatoes, carrots, and onions, $3 worth of vegetables stretched across a 20-pound deer that cost nothing but the dent in his truck's bumper. The State Wildlife Commission would ban roadkill collection 2 years later, claiming sanitation concerns, but what they really meant was that free meat was cutting into licensed hunting revenue. Modern grocery stores sell ethically sourced venison for $32 a pound and call it premium. What they don't tell you is that your neighbor's 1974 roadkill stew, cooked low and slow until the gamey smell turned sweet and the meat fell off the bone with a fork, tasted better than anything Whole Foods will ever stock, because desperation is the best seasoning, and corporations can't trademark that. In a Detroit apartment in March 1973, when Mrs. Dorothy Pierce's grocery budget dropped to $18 a week and ground beef hit $2 a pound, she walked past the meat counter and bought a pound of beef liver for 39 cents instead. The texture was slippery, almost slimy when she sliced it thin. No sizzle, no pan, just raw liver laid between 2 pieces of Wonder Bread with a slice of raw onion that made your eyes water from 3 feet away. Her kids gagged the first time, but by the 3rd week of eating it twice a week, they stopped complaining, because hunger makes you grateful for iron-rich organ meat that tastes like pennies and regret. The FDA issued warnings in 1975 about parasites in raw liver, and by 1978, grocery stores started pulling it from shelves unless it was marked for cooking only. What they didn't say was that poor families had been eating it raw since the Depression, and the only thing that changed was that corporations realized they couldn't sell a 99-cent convenience version of poverty. Did your grandmother make you eat raw liver, or did she fry it first and tell you it was steak? Drop it in the comments, because we're documenting the meals they tried to shame out of existence. Walk into a backyard in Richmond, Virginia in September 1975 when Mr. Harold Bennett set a wire trap behind his garage and caught 3 gray squirrels in 2 days. Free protein in a year when a whole chicken cost $3 and fed a family of 5 exactly once. The sound was the wet snap of the trap closing, and the smell was the acrid burn of singed fur as he held each carcass over a propane torch to remove the pelt, a method his grandfather taught him in 1932. His wife Ruby stewed them low and slow with lima beans, corn, tomatoes, and a splash of vinegar to cut the gamey musk, and the pot would simmer for 6 hours until the meat separated from the tiny bones with just a wooden spoon's pressure. By 1977, the city of Richmond passed an ordinance banning urban wildlife trapping for consumption, citing rabies risk. But the real reason was that suburban neighbors complained to the zoning board that it looked like Appalachia. Corporations later sold you Heritage Recipe, Brunswick stew in a can for $4, made with farm-raised chicken that never had to fight for an acorn. The squirrel stew had a wild, earthy taste that scared city people because it reminded them that food used to have a face, and modern convenience is just expensive amnesia. In a Pittsburgh neighborhood in May 1972, when Mrs. Helen Kowalski's grocery budget couldn't stretch to cover iceberg lettuce at 49 cents a head, she walked 3 blocks to an empty lot with a plastic grocery bag and filled it with dandelion greens, wild onions, and purslane, all free, all growing in the same soil where the city had dumped construction debris 2 years prior. The texture was tough and bitter, nothing like the waxed, tasteless lettuce from the A&P, and she'd soak the greens in cold water for an hour to leach out the bitterness, then toss them with bacon, grease, and vinegar because oil cost money and pork fat was free if you saved it. Her kids called it weed salad and refused to eat it until she reminded them that the neighbor kids were eating hamburger helper for the 3rd night in a row, and at least this had vitamins. By 1976, the EPA started issuing warnings about lead contamination in urban soil, particularly near roads where leaded gasoline exhaust had been settling for decades, and foraging wild greens in the city became a public health risk. What they didn't mention was that poor families had been eating roadside dandelions since the 1930s, and the only thing that changed was that corporations realized they couldn't package and sell weeds. Did your grandmother pick dandelions from the yard, or did she pay for lettuce? Tell me in the comments, because this is the kind of knowledge Whole Foods will never teach you. These first 5 meals weren't recipes, they were courtroom evidence that survival looks ugly when you write it down. In 1974, the FDA, USDA, and state wildlife commissions looked at kitchens like Martha Caldwell's and Harold Bennett's and saw disorder. They saw roadkill, raw organs, trapped squirrels, and foraged weeds, and they called it public health risk. But what they really saw was a population that had stopped buying their products, stopped trusting their supply chain, and started feeding themselves with things that couldn't be taxed, regulated, or repackaged. The next 5 meals show you exactly why they had to call it banned. Walk into a Chicago housing project kitchen in January 1976 when Mrs. Beatrice Washington opened the 5-pound block of orange government commodity cheese, the kind that came in a plain brown box with USDA stamped on the side and no brand name, no nutrition label, no barcode. The texture was waxy, almost plastic, and it wouldn't melt right in a regular oven. It would separate into oil and solids, making a greasy puddle on top of whatever you were trying to stretch it across. She'd cube it, mix it with canned tomatoes, stale bread, and powdered milk, then bake it at 350 degrees for an hour until the top formed a rubbery crust that you had to saw through with a serrated knife. It tasted like salt and regret, but it was free, and it fed her 6 kids for 3 nights when her welfare check was late, and the corner store wouldn't extend credit. By 1982, the government started phasing out commodity cheese distribution, claiming improved food stamp efficiency. But the real reason was that giving people free food made them less dependent on grocery store chains, and corporate lobbyists wanted that dependency back. Modern foodies now pay $12 for artisan government cheese at farmers' markets and call it vintage Americana. The difference? Your grandmother's 1976 casserole wasn't Instagram ready. It was survival in a brown box, and it kept you alive when the system said you didn't deserve butter. In a Memphis kitchen in August 1973, when Mr. Charles Hayes bought 3 pounds of chicken gizzards and hearts for 67 cents at the butcher shop, offal the white families wouldn't touch and the butcher was about to throw away, he brought them home in a brown paper bag that was already soaking through with blood by the time he reached his back door. The sound was the wet slap of the organs hitting the cutting board, and the smell was metallic, almost coppery. like sucking on a penny after you bit your tongue. His wife Evelyn would flour them heavy, fry them in a cast-iron skillet with lard until they were crispy on the outside and chewy on the inside, and serve them with white bread and hot sauce, because sides cost money they didn't have. The kids would fight over the hearts because they were tender, and leave the gizzards for last because you had to chew each piece for 2 minutes before you could swallow. By 1979, the USDA started reclassifying organ meats as variety meats and restricting their sale in certain states due to consumer confusion. But what they really meant was that poor black families were buying the cheap cuts and stretching them too far, and the meat industry wanted to upsell them to chicken breasts at 4 times the price. Modern chefs now serve fried gizzards at gastropubs for $14 an appetizer and call it nose-to-tail dining. The difference? Your family ate them in 1973 because they were the only meat you could afford, not because a food critic told you it was authentic. Walk into a rural Alabama kitchen in November 1974 when Mr. D. Luther Jackson trapped a 12-pound opossum in his chicken coop at 3 a.m. and decided it was either supper or a wasted trap. The smell was musky and wild, and the first thing his wife Darlene did was soak the whole carcass in cold salt water overnight to pull out the gamey funk that would otherwise make the meat taste like wet dog and swamp mud. By noon the next day, she'd roasted it low and slow with sweet potatoes and onions, and the fat would render out into the pan, mixing with the yam sugars to create a glaze that looked like Thanksgiving but tasted like survival. The meat was dark, stringy, and greasy, nothing like the farm-raised pork the government wanted you to buy, and you had to gnaw it off the bone like you were angry at it. By 1976, Alabama game regulations banned the trapping and consumption of opossum without a hunting license, citing rabies vector species. But the real reason was that rural families were feeding themselves for free, while grocery stores lost revenue. Modern survivalist blogs now romanticize possum recipes as lost Appalachian cuisine, but they won't tell you that Luther Jackson's 1974 possum roast wasn't a cultural statement. It was Tuesday night dinner when the welfare check was 3 days late and the chicken coop needed protecting anyway. In a Pennsylvania Dutch farmhouse in December 1972, when Mr. Jacob Yoder slaughtered his backyard pig on a Saturday morning before the sun came up, his wife collected the blood in a 5-gallon bucket, still warm and steaming in the cold air, and by noon she'd mixed it with oatmeal, pork fat, onions, and black pepper to make blood sausage that would keep in the cellar for 3 months. The texture was dense, almost crumbly, and the taste was iron-heavy, like licking a rusty nail, but it was protein you didn't have to buy, and in a year when pork chops cost $2 a pound at the grocery store, a home-slaughtered pig gave you 60 pounds of meat for the cost of feed and a bullet. The sound was the hiss of the casing filling with the blood mixture, and the smell was metallic and earthy, like a slaughterhouse floor, and it would cling to your clothes for days. By 1975, the USDA started requiring licensed slaughter facilities for pork processing, effectively banning home slaughter in most counties unless you wanted to risk a $500 fine and a meat inspector showing up at your door. Corporations later sold you boudin noir at specialty stores for $16 a pound and called it French heritage charcuterie. The difference? Jacob Yoder's 1972 blood sausage was made because buying store pork meant his kids didn't get winter coats, and authenticity tastes different when it's mandatory. Walk into a cabin in rural Oregon in October 1975 when Mrs. Linda Carter walked into the woods behind her property with a wicker basket and came back 2 hours later with 5 pounds of mushrooms she couldn't positively identify, but that looked close enough to the morals she remembered from childhood. The smell was earthy and damp, like wet leaves and rotting logs, and she'd saute them in butter. Real butter, not margarine, because this was a special occasion, meaning they had no other food in the house, and she was gambling that these fungi wouldn't kill her family. The taste was rich, almost meaty, with a slippery texture that coated your tongue, and the kids ate 2 bowls each before anyone asked what kind of mushrooms they were. By morning, everyone was fine, but by 1978, the FDA had issued warnings against foraging wild mushrooms without expert verification, and several states banned the sale of foraged fungi at farmers' markets due to liability concerns. What they didn't say was that poor families had been gambling on mushroom identification since the frontier days, and the only difference now was that corporations wanted you to buy their cultivated white buttons for $6 a pound instead of walking into the woods for free. Modern foragers now pay $200 for mushroom identification courses and call it rewilding. The difference? Linda Carter's 1975 mushroom soup wasn't a hobby. It was a coin flip between dinner and the emergency room, and she won. In a Brooklyn apartment in February 1973, when Mrs. Rosa Martinez's food stamps ran out 5 days before the next distribution, and she had 3 kids under 10 who wouldn't stop asking when dinner was ready, she opened 2 cans of mackerel, 49 cents each at the corner bodega, and mixed them with government commodity flour, powdered eggs, and tap water to form patties that smelled like low tide and tasted like desperation. The texture was mushy and fishy, and the smell would soak into the hallway wallpaper for 3 days, but she'd fry them in a half-inch of vegetable oil until they were crispy on the outside and still soft in the middle, and serve them on white bread with ketchup, because condiments hide a lot of sins. Her kids would pick out the tiny bones and line them up on the edge of their plates like they were building a fence, and she'd tell them that fish bones were good luck, even though she knew they were just too poor to afford boneless fish. By 1976, the USDA started restricting the types of fish allowed in commodity distribution, claiming quality control standards. But what they really meant was that canned mackerel was too cheap and too effective at keeping poor families fed without needing the grocery store supply chain. Modern chefs now serve mackerel croquettes at brunch spots for $18 and call it coastal grandmother chic. The difference? Rosa Martinez's 1973 mackerel patties weren't Instagrammable. They were the meal you made when the system forgot you existed, and they tasted like proof that you were still here. By now, you've seen 10 meals that the FDA, USDA, and state regulators looked at and decided were too dangerous, too uncontrolled, or too free to allow. But the real danger wasn't the food. It was the fact that families like Martha Caldwell, Harold Bennett, and Rosa Martinez had stopped asking permission to survive. They trapped squirrels, foraged mushrooms, slaughtered their own pigs, and ate things that couldn't be barcoded, taxed, or recalled. The next 10 meals show you exactly what they were trying to erase: independence. And corporations hate nothing more than a customer who doesn't need them. Walk into a suburban Sacramento backyard in March 1974 when Mr. Dennis Sullivan raised 12 New Zealand white rabbits in a plywood hutch he built from scrap lumber, and every 2 months he'd cull 4 of them for meat. 24 pounds of protein that cost him only the price of alfalfa pellets and water. The sound was the sharp crack of a wooden club against the back of a rabbit's skull, quick and efficient, and the smell was the wet fur and exposed muscle as he skinned them within 10 minutes of the kill. His wife Karen would stew them low and slow with carrots, potatoes, and canned tomatoes, and the meat was mild, almost sweet, falling off the bone like rotisserie chicken, but with a texture that was denser, more fibrous, like dark meat turkey. The kids never asked what kind of meat it was, and she never volunteered the information. because suburban neighbors had already complained to the homeowners association that the hutch was unsightly and smelled like a farm. By 1976, Sacramento County passed an ordinance banning livestock animals in residential zones, effectively shutting down backyard rabbit operations and forcing families like the Sullivans to buy store-bought chicken at 3 times the cost. Modern homesteaders now pay $40 for heritage breed rabbit from specialty butchers and call it sustainable protein. The difference? Dennis Sullivan's 1974 rabbits weren't a lifestyle brand. They were the reason his kids had meat twice a week when ground beef was a luxury item, and the county killed that independence with a zoning code. In a Detroit kitchen in December 1975, when Mrs. Janice Coleman couldn't afford sugar to make Christmas candy, sugar hit 98 cents a pound during the recession, she poured a bottle of Caro corn syrup into a pot, added a handful of peanuts, and boiled it until it reached hard crack stage, then poured it onto a buttered cookie sheet to cool into a brittle that was sticky, tooth-crackingly hard, and tasted like chemical sweetness with a metallic aftertaste. The smell was burnt sugar and something vaguely industrial, like the inside of a factory, and the texture would glue your teeth together for a full 30 seconds before it finally dissolved into a slick film that coated your tongue. Her kids loved it because it was candy, and candy was rare, and they didn't know that real peanut brittle was supposed to be made with sugar, butter, and vanilla. By 1978, the FDA started issuing warnings about high fructose corn syrup consumption in children, and by the 1980s, corn syrup became the villain in the childhood obesity epidemic. But what they didn't say was that poor families weren't choosing corn syrup because it was healthier. They were choosing it because it was 60 cents cheaper than sugar, and desperation doesn't read nutrition labels. Modern food activists now demonize corn syrup as corporate poison, but they won't tell you that Janice Coleman's 1975 Caro Brittle was the only Christmas present her kids got that year, and it tasted like love, even if it was made from petrochemicals. Walk into a kitchen in rural Kansas in November 1973 when Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell made an apple pie for Thanksgiving with 0 apples, just a sleeve of saltine crackers soaked in a mixture of water, sugar, cream of tartar, and cinnamon, baked in a pie crust until the crackers softened and took on a texture that was wet, mushy, and vaguely fruit-like if you squinted and didn't think too hard. The smell was artificial cinnamon and baked dough, and the taste was sweet and starchy with a salty aftertaste from the crackers. And if you closed your eyes and wanted to believe it was apple pie, your brain would cooperate just enough to make you forget you were eating compressed flour and disappointment. Her husband took one bite, said it was fine, and asked for a second slice, because gratitude is mandatory when your wife is performing culinary alchemy with a 69-cent box of crackers. The recipe came from the back of a Nabisco saltine box, printed during the Depression and revived during the 1970s recession when apples were $1 a pound and pies were for rich people. By 1979, Nabisco quietly removed the recipe from their packaging, claiming consumer preference shifts. But the real reason was that admitting your product could be used as a poverty substitute for fruit was bad for brand image. Modern food bloggers now make mock apple pie as a quirky vintage experiment and call it surprisingly good. The difference? Eleanor Mitchell's 1973 pie wasn't quirky. It was the only dessert on her Thanksgiving table, and it tasted like proof that you could still have dignity even when you couldn't afford apples. In a West Virginia holler in October 1974, when Mr. Raymond Cooper Field dressed a doe he shot with a .30-06 at dawn and brought the heart home in a Ziploc bag still warm and slick with blood, His wife Patty sliced it thin, pounded it flat with a meat mallet, and fried it in half an inch of pork lard until it was crispy on the outside and still rare in the middle, with a texture that was chewy like a cheap steak and a taste that was iron-heavy, almost livery, but milder than beef liver and less offensive than kidney. The smell was gamey and metallic, and the sound was the sizzle of blood hitting hot fat, and she'd serve it with white bread and no sides because vegetables cost money and a deer heart was free. The kids would eat it without complaint because they'd been raised to know that wasting food was a sin, and by the time they were teenagers, they'd brag to their city cousins that they'd eaten heart, liver, kidneys, and tongue, and the city kids would look at them like they were feral. By 1976, the USDA started issuing guidelines about chronic wasting disease in wild deer, and by the early 1980s, several states banned the consumption of deer organs due to prion risk, but the real reason was that wild game consumption was undercutting grocery store meat sales. Modern hunters now pay $40 to have a processor remove and discard the organs, then they buy ground venison for $12 a pound. The difference? Raymond Cooper's 1974 deer heart fried in lard cost nothing but the price of a bullet and tasted like the last meal you'd eat before corporations convinced you that free food was dangerous. Walk into a Philadelphia row house in January 1972 when Mrs. Agnes Murphy's grocery budget couldn't cover eggs, bacon, or even oatmeal, so she toasted a slice of white bread until it was golden and brittle, placed it in a bowl, poured hot milk over it until the bread turned soggy and collapsed into itself, then sprinkled it with sugar and a pat of margarine that melted into yellow pools on the surface. The texture was mush, pure wet bread mush, and the taste was vaguely sweet, vaguely buttery, and overwhelmingly bland, like eating wet cardboard that had been left in a bakery overnight. Her kids hated it, called it baby food for old people, but they ate it because there was nothing else, and by the third morning in a row, they stopped complaining and just swallowed it in silence. Milk toast was a Depression-era holdover that came back during the 1970s recession when even cereal was too expensive, and it fed kids for under 50 cents a meal when grocery prices doubled in 18 months. By 1978, breakfast cereal companies started running ad campaigns calling milk toast nutritionally inadequate and pushing cornflakes and Rice Krispies as essential childhood nutrition, and by the 1980s, milk toast had vanished from American kitchens. Modern food historians now call it comfort food from the Great Depression, but they won't tell you that Agnes Murphy's 1972 milk toast wasn't comforting. It was proof that inflation can force a generation to eat like their grandparents, and nostalgia tastes different when it's mandatory. These 15 meals weren't banned because they were unsafe. They were banned because they were uncontrollable. When families started trapping their own meat, foraging their own greens, slaughtering their own livestock, and feeding their kids with saltine crackers and corn syrup, they stopped being reliable consumers. The FDA called it public health risk. The USDA called it quality control. State regulators called it zoning violations. But what they all meant was the same thing. You're not allowed to survive without buying our product. The next 15 meals prove they lost that fight. In a Louisiana bayou kitchen in March 1973, when Mr. Antoine Thibodeau brought home a pig's head from the slaughterhouse for $2, the part the grocery stores threw away because it didn't photograph well, his wife Marie spent 6 hours boiling it until the meat fell off the bone, the cartilage turned to jelly, and the whole kitchen smelled like a rendering plant, mixed with bay leaves and black pepper. She'd pick every scrap of meat, tongue, cheek, and ear from the skull, chop it fine, mix it with the gelatinous cooking liquid, and pour it into a loaf pan to set overnight in the icebox. By morning it was solid, sliceable, and looked like cold cuts made from nightmares, chunks of pink and gray meat suspended in clear jelly, with bits of skin and fat that caught the light like broken glass. The taste was porky and rich, with a texture that was simultaneously creamy and chewy, and you'd slice it thin and eat it on crackers because bread was too expensive. The kids wouldn't touch it, called it brain food, even though there was no brain in it, but Antoine and Marie ate it for lunch every day for 2 weeks because it was 30 servings of protein for $2. By 1977, the USDA started restricting the sale of pork heads to licensed processors only, citing sanitation standards. But the real reason was that head cheese was too cheap, too efficient, and too ethnic to fit the sanitized grocery store meat case. Modern charcuterie boards now serve pâté de tête for $22 and call it rustic French butchery. The difference? Marie Thibodeau's 1973 head cheese wasn't rustic. It was what you made when a pig's head was the only meat you could afford, and it tasted like resourcefulness that corporations later rebranded as artisanal. Walk into a Dayton, Ohio, apartment in August 1975 when Mrs. Linda Hayes couldn't afford hamburger or hot dogs, so she bought a 2-pound chub of bologna for $1.19 and fried thick slices in a dry pan until the edges curled up like bowls and the center blistered and popped. Then she'd brush them with ketchup and let it caramelize into a sticky glaze that tasted like fake smoke and sugar. The smell was processed meat and burnt tomato paste, and the texture was rubbery on the outside, spongy in the middle, with a flavor that was salt, fat, and desperation. She'd serve it with white bread and nothing else, and her kids would eat it without complaint because fried bologna was still meat, and meat meant you were doing okay, even when you weren't. By 1978, the USDA started issuing warnings about nitrates in processed meats, and grocery stores began labeling bologna as not recommended for frequent consumption. But what they didn't say was that bologna was the only meat poor families could afford at under $2 a pound, and attacking bologna was attacking their last affordable protein source. Modern food snobs now mock bologna as mystery meat and poor people food, but they won't tell you that Linda Hayes's 1975 fried bologna with ketchup glaze fed 3 kids dinner for under $2 when ground beef was $4 a pound, and it tasted like survival even if it came in a plastic wrapper. In a Pittsburgh row house in December 1972, when Mr. Stanley Kowalski's wife saved bacon drippings in a coffee can on the stovetop for 6 months until she had a full pound of solidified pork fat. She'd spread it on white bread like butter, sprinkle it with salt, and toast it under the broiler until the fat melted and soaked into the bread, leaving it translucent and glistening like a piece of meat-flavored glass. The smell was smoky, porky, and overwhelming, and the taste was pure animal fat with a salty crunch, and the bread would disintegrate in your mouth into greasy fragments that coated your tongue and made you thirsty for an hour. The kids loved it because it tasted like bacon without the bacon, and Stanley loved it because it was free, just the leftover fat from breakfast stretched into a snack that kept them full between meals when meals were getting smaller. By 1976, the American Heart Association started issuing warnings about saturated fat and cholesterol, and by the late 1970s, bacon grease became the dietary villain in the heart disease epidemic. But what they didn't say was that poor families weren't eating bacon grease because it was healthy. They were eating it because butter cost $1.69 a pound, and bacon fat was free if you never threw anything away. Modern keto dieters now pay $6 for grass-fed tallow and call it ancestral eating. The difference? Stanley Kowalski's 1972 grease bread wasn't ancestral. It was what you made when the pantry was empty and the coffee can was full, and it tasted like the working-class defiance that nutritionists would later call ignorance. Walk into a Miami efficiency apartment in July 1974 when Mrs. Carmen Rodriguez opened a tin of sardines packed in mustard sauce, 69 cents at the corner store, and ate them straight from the can with a fork, standing over the sink because the smell was so strong it would soak into the furniture if she sat at the table. The texture was oily and soft, almost mushy, and the taste was fishy and vinegary and overwhelming, and the tiny bones would crunch between your teeth like eating toenail clippings if you didn't chew carefully. She'd mash them with a fork, spread them on saltines, and call it lunch because sardines were shelf-stable, high in protein, and didn't require refrigeration in an apartment where the AC was broken, and turning on the oven meant the temperature hit 98 degrees by noon. Her son refused to eat them, said they smelled like cat food and vinegar, but Carmen ate a can every day for 2 weeks when her paycheck was delayed and the food stamps hadn't arrived yet. By 1977, sardines started disappearing from mainstream grocery stores, relegated to ethnic food aisles, because Americans decided they were too foreign and too smelly. But the real reason was that canned fish was too cheap and too self-sufficient, and grocery chains wanted you buying fresh fish at 6 times the price. Modern wellness influencers now promote sardines as omega-3 superfoods and charge $4 a tin for wild-caught Portuguese imports. The difference? Carmen Rodriguez's 1974 sardines weren't a superfood. They were the meal you ate when the system forgot you existed, and they tasted like proof that survival doesn't need to smell good. In a Dallas kitchen in February 1973, when Mrs. Loretta Jackson bought a 1-pound bag of dried pinto beans for 38 cents and a single ham hock for 99 cents, she'd soak the beans overnight, then simmer them with the hock for 6 hours until the kitchen smelled like smoked pork and the beans turned creamy and the meat fell off the bone into salty, fatty shreds. She'd make 1 pot on Sunday and stretch it across 3 dinners: Monday with cornbread, Tuesday over rice, Wednesday mashed with a fork and fried into bean cakes, and by the 3rd night the kids would beg for anything else, but there was nothing else, so they ate beans and learned that complaining about food was the fastest way to get a lecture about the Depression. The taste was earthy, smoky, and heavy, and the texture was thick enough to coat a spoon, and after 3 days in the fridge, the beans would develop a sour tang that wasn't quite spoiled but wasn't quite fresh, and Loretta would reheat them anyway, because wasting food was a sin her mother had beaten into her in 1935. By 1978, the USDA started promoting quick-cook canned beans as modern convenience, and dried beans started vanishing from grocery store shelves because corporations couldn't make enough profit on a 38-cent bag that fed a family for 3 days. Modern meal prep influencers now call bean-based meals budget-friendly plant protein, but they won't tell you that Loretta Jackson's 1973 pinto beans with ham hock weren't budget-friendly by choice. They were what you ate when the budget was $8 a week, and the ham hock was the only meat you'd see until payday. By now, you've seen 20 meals that regulators, corporations, and suburban homeowners associations tried to legislate out of existence. They banned roadkill, restricted organ meat sales, outlawed backyard livestock, demonized bacon grease, and called sardines too ethnic. But the families who cooked these meals didn't care what the FDA thought of their squirrel stew or what the American Heart Association said about their lard-fried bread. They cared about feeding their kids when inflation doubled grocery prices in 18 months. The next 10 meals show you what happened when survival stopped asking for permission. Walk into a Bronx apartment in January 1972 when Mrs. Evelyn Martinez bought 3 pounds of oxtail for 79 cents a pound at the butcher shop, the bony, gelatinous tail cuts that white customers refused to buy because they looked like dog food, and she'd simmer them for 8 hours with carrots, celery, and potatoes until the cartilage melted and the broth turned thick and glossy like liquid meat jelly. The smell was rich and beefy and filled the whole apartment building stairwell, and neighbors would knock on her door to ask what she was cooking because oxtail soup smelled like wealth, even when it was poverty. The meat would fall off the bone in tender shreds, and the marrow would ooze out like buttery pudding, and you'd suck the bones clean because wasting marrow was a crime in her kitchen. Her kids loved it, called it special soup, and Evelyn never told them that oxtail was the cheapest cut in the butcher case, the part rich people threw away. By 1979, oxtail prices started climbing, and by the 1990s, they hit $12 a pound, because chefs discovered them and called them luxury peasant food, and poor families got priced out of the cut that used to keep them fed. Modern restaurants now charge $32 for a bowl of oxtail soup and call it rustic Caribbean fusion. The difference? Evelyn Martinez's 1972 oxtail soup was rustic because it was all she could afford, and it tasted like the last time a poor family could buy a premium cut before gentrification turned poverty food into a luxury item. In a San Francisco Chinatown apartment in November 1974, when Mrs. Lily Chen bought 2 pounds of chicken feet for 39 cents at the market, the part of the chicken Americans wouldn't eat because it had toenails and zero meat, she'd boil them for hours until the cartilage softened and the collagen turned the broth into a thick, viscous gel that wobbled like Jell-O when you spooned it. The smell was chickeny and slightly funky, and the texture was slippery and gelatinous, and you'd gnaw on the feet like corn on the cob, sucking the soft skin and tendons off the tiny bones and spitting the nails into a bowl. The taste was mild, almost neutral, but the richness of the broth made it feel like you were eating something substantial, even though there was no meat. Her kids grew up thinking chicken feet soup was normal, and it wasn't until they went to white friends' houses that they realized most Americans thought eating feet was disgusting. By 1978, California health codes started requiring sanitized processing for chicken feet, and by the 1980s, they disappeared from most American grocery stores, relegated to ethnic markets only. Modern bone broth companies now charge $12 for a quart of collagen-rich chicken broth and market it as a gut health superfood. The difference? Lily Chen's 1974 chicken feet soup wasn't a health trend. It was what you made when chicken feet cost 39 cents and chicken breasts cost $2 a pound, and it tasted like the knowledge that Americans waste the best parts of the animal and call it civilized. Walk into a Honolulu kitchen in June 1975 when Mrs. Kathy Nakamura sliced a can of Spam into thick slabs, fried them in a dry pan until the edges caramelized and turned crispy, then added canned pineapple rings and let the juice reduce into a sweet glaze that tasted like ham and candy and made your teeth ache. The smell was porky and tropical and artificial, and the texture was soft and spongy like lunch meat that had been compressed into a brick and fried until it forgot it was supposed to be spreadable. She'd serve it over rice because rice was cheap and filling, and the combination of salty processed pork and sweet canned fruit was the kind of flavor profile that only made sense during a recession when you had to make 79-cent Spam taste like a meal instead of a mistake. The kids loved it because it tasted like a treat, and Kathy never told them that Spam was what you ate when you couldn't afford real ham. By 1978, Spam became culturally associated with poor island food, and mainland Americans started mocking it as mystery meat. But the real reason was that Spam was too cheap, too shelf-stable, and too effective at keeping families fed without needing refrigeration. Modern food trucks now serve gourmet Spam sliders for $12 and call it Hawaiian street food. The difference? Kathy Nakamura's 1975 fried Spam with pineapple wasn't gourmet. It was what you made when canned meat and canned fruit were the only proteins you could afford, and it tasted like resilience that mainlanders later rebranded as ironic. in a East L.A. kitchen in September 1973 when Mr. Rafael Gomez bought a whole beef tongue for $2 at the carniceria, the organ meat that white butchers threw away because it looked too much like what it was. He'd boil it for 3 hours until the thick outer skin peeled off in sheets, and the meat underneath was tender and pink like pot roast, but denser and fattier. His wife Maria would dice it fine, fry it in lard with onions and cilantro, and wrap it in corn tortillas that she made by hand, because store-bought tortillas cost 10 cents each and homemade cost 2 cents. The taste was rich and beefy and slightly livery, and the texture was soft but chewy, and you had to chew each bite thoroughly before swallowing, or it would sit in your stomach like a rock. The kids loved it, called it the good tacos, and Raphael never told them that tongue was the cheapest beef cut in the store because Americans were too squeamish to eat it. By 1977, beef tongue prices started climbing, and by the 1980s, it hit $6 a pound because upscale taquerias discovered it and called it authentic street food, and poor families got priced out of the cut that used to be their staple protein. Modern taco trucks now charge $5 per tongue taco and market it as traditional Mexican cuisine. The difference? Maria Gomez's 1973 beef tongue tacos were traditional because it was all they could afford, and it tasted like the last time a working-class family could buy organ meat before food trends turned poverty into a premium. Walk into an Atlanta kitchen in March 1974 when Mrs. Ruby Lee Washington bought a 5-pound bundle of collard greens for 68 cents at the farmer's market. The tough, bitter leaves that took 3 hours to cook and tasted like lawn clippings, unless you knew the secret. She'd wash them in the bathtub to get the grit out, then chop them rough and throw them in a pot with the drippings from last night's pork chops. Pure pork fat, no meat, just the brown, sticky residue from the bottom of the pan, and simmer them low and slow until they turned dark green and silky, and the bitterness cooked out and left behind something earthy and almost sweet. The smell was pork fat and green vegetables and would fill the whole house, and the taste was rich and fatty and vegetable-forward in a way that felt healthy, even though it was cooked in pure animal fat. She'd serve them with cornbread to soak up the pot liquor, the cooking liquid that was basically pork broth mixed with green juice, and her kids would fight over who got to mop the bowl clean. By 1977, the American Heart Association started issuing warnings about cooking vegetables in animal fat, and by the 1980s, collard greens started appearing in grocery stores, pre-washed and ready to sauté, which meant they were bland and tasteless because no one was cooking them in pork fat anymore. Modern soul food restaurants now charge $14 for a side of collard greens cooked the old way and call it traditional Southern cuisine. The difference? Ruby Lee Washington's 1974 collard greens weren't traditional by design. They were what you made when pork drippings were free and vegetables were 68 cents a bundle, and they tasted like the knowledge that fat is flavor and corporations can't sell you that wisdom in a bag. In a Milwaukee apartment in October 1972, when Mrs. Diane Kowalski had $3 left until payday and 4 kids to feed for 3 days, she bought a 10-pound bag of potatoes for $1.49 and 2 yellow onions for 19 cents. And that was dinner for 3 nights straight. She'd peel and slice the potatoes thin, chop the onions fine, and fry them together in a cast-iron skillet with 2 tablespoons of lard until the potatoes were golden and crispy on the edges and soft in the middle, and the onions caramelized into sweet, sticky threads. The smell was starchy and savory and filled the apartment, and the taste was simple: salt, fat, potato, onion. But after 3 nights in a row, the kids would stare at their plates and say, "Not again," in voices that sounded like prayer. Diane would tell them that her mother fed 7 kids on fried potatoes during the Depression, and no one complained, so they'd shut up and eat, and by the 4th night when payday came and she made hamburgers, they'd act like she'd cooked them a steak. By 1976, the USDA started promoting balanced meals with protein, vegetable, and starch, and fried potatoes became associated with nutritional ignorance. But what they didn't say was that balanced meals cost money and potatoes cost $1.50 for 10 pounds. Modern brunch spots now serve hash browns with caramelized onions for $9 and call it rustic comfort food. The difference? Diane Kowalski's 1972 fried potatoes and onions weren't rustic. They were what you made when the budget was $3 and the kids needed to eat for 3 days, and they tasted like the arithmetic of survival. Walk into a rural Kentucky kitchen in January 1973 when Mrs. Betty Harper boiled water, poured in a cup of cornmeal while stirring constantly to avoid lumps, and cooked it into a thick porridge that looked like wet cement and tasted like corn-flavored paste. She'd pour it into a loaf pan, let it set overnight until it was solid enough to slice, then fry the slabs in bacon grease until they were crispy on the outside and creamy on the inside. The texture was dense and gritty, and the taste was bland unless you drowned it in maple syrup or sorghum molasses, and the kids would eat it without complaining because fried mush was better than plain oatmeal, which was the other option. A 10-pound bag of cornmeal cost 79 cents and would last 3 weeks, and Betty Harper's grocery budget was $12, so fried mush appeared on the breakfast table 5 mornings a week, whether anyone liked it or not. By 1978, Italian restaurants started serving polenta for $16 and calling it Northern Italian peasant cuisine, and by the 1990s, polenta became a trendy side dish in upscale restaurants, and no one mentioned that it was the same fried cornmeal mush that poor Appalachian families had been eating since the 1800s. Modern foodies now Instagram their polenta and call it artisanal. The difference? Betty Harper's 1973 cornmeal mush wasn't artisanal. It was what you made when oatmeal was too expensive and cornmeal was 79 cents for 10 pounds, and it tasted like the kind of poverty that gentrification would later call authentic. In a Boston apartment in December 1975, when Mr. Patrick O'Brien's unemployment check was late and his wife Ellen had 87 cents in her purse and 4 kids asking what's for dinner, she opened a can of corned beef hash, 69 cents at the corner store, and fried it in a dry pan until the bottom formed a dark brown crust that tasted like burnt meat and potato starch, held together with gelatin and regret. The smell was salty and processed, and the texture was mushy with occasional chunks of something that might have been potato or might have been fat, and it came out of the can in one solid cylinder that jiggled like meat jello when you slid it onto the cutting board. She'd serve it with white bread and ketchup, and the kids would eat it in silence because they knew better than to complain when money was tight, and complaining meant listening to their father talk about eating nothing but cabbage soup for 6 months during the Depression. By 1978, canned corned beef hash became culturally coded as drunk food or hangover food, and grocery stores started moving it to the bottom shelf, where you wouldn't see it unless you were looking for it. Modern brunch spots now serve house-made corned beef hash for $18 with poached eggs and call it New England comfort food. The difference? Ellen O'Brien's 1975 canned corned beef hash wasn't comfort. It was what you opened when the unemployment check was late and the kids were hungry, and it tasted like the kind of poverty that polite society later pretended never happened. Walk into a suburban New Jersey kitchen in July 1974 when Mrs. Nancy Rodriguez opened 2 cans of kidney beans, 38 cents each, drained them, and tossed them with diced onions, a splash of white vinegar, a tablespoon of sugar, and a drizzle of vegetable oil to make a salad that was cold, crunchy, and tasted like pickled beans with an aftertaste that made your mouth pucker. The texture was starchy and firm, almost chalky, and the vinegar was so strong it made your eyes water if you leaned too close to the bowl, and the kids would pick at it like it was punishment because cold beans weren't real food in their minds. Real food was hot, and this was just a way to stretch 76 cents worth of canned beans into a side dish that served 6. Nancy would tell them it was summer salad, even though it was winter half the time she made it, and the only reason it was summer was because you didn't have to turn on the oven and heat up the apartment. By 1977, three-bean salad disappeared from American potlucks and picnics, replaced by pasta salad and coleslaw from the deli counter, and kidney bean salad became associated with old people food. Modern meal prep influencers now promote bean-based salads as high-fiber budget meals, but they use fresh vegetables, olive oil, and lemon juice, not canned beans and white vinegar. The difference? Nancy Rodriguez's 1974 kidney bean salad wasn't a meal prep trend. It was what you made when 76 cents had to feed 6 people, and it tasted like the kind of resourcefulness that Instagram will never photograph. Walk into a rural Iowa kitchen in November 1973. When Mrs. Dorothy Bennett stood at her Formica counter staring at an empty refrigerator and a Depression-era cookbook her mother had pressed into her hands 4 years earlier with the warning, "You'll need this someday." That day was Thanksgiving 1973, when ground beef cost $2 a pound, eggs were 79 cents a dozen, and her grocery budget was $14 for a family of 6. She was making a Thanksgiving pie with no apples, no pumpkin, no eggs, and no milk. Just 1 cup of flour, 1 cup of sugar, 3 tablespoons of butter, and 2 cups of cold tap water mixed into a filling that looked like wallpaper paste and poured like joint compound. The sound was the scrape of a wooden spoon against a chipped mixing bowl, and the smell, once it hit the oven, was butter browning and sugar caramelizing into something that made your mouth water, even though your brain knew it was a lie. It baked at 350 degrees for 45 minutes, and what came out resembled custard, if you squinted and didn't ask questions, a wobbly, translucent filling that jiggled when you cut into it and oozed a thin, syrupy liquid that pooled on the plate like melted jello. The texture was gelatinous and slippery, somewhere between flan and wallpaper paste, and the taste was sweet and starchy with a weird, chalky aftertaste that came from the flour not fully dissolving into the water. But if you closed your eyes, held your breath, and wanted desperately to believe it was a real pie, your brain would cooperate just enough to make you grateful. Her kids each had a slice and said, "Thank you," in voices that sounded like they were at a funeral, because gratitude is mandatory when your mother is performing miracles with a cup of flour and 2 cups of tap water. Her husband took 2 bites, paused, then took a third, and said it was fine, which in 1973, Iowa was the highest compliment you could give a pie made from nothing. The recipe came from a 1932 cookbook titled Make Do and Mend, and Dorothy's mother had handed it to her in 1969 with the inscription, "For when times get hard again." Dorothy had never opened it until October 1973, when the recession turned hard times from a grandparent's memory into a weekly reality. These 30 meals weren't banned because they were dangerous. They were banned because they worked. When families started making pies from water, soup from roadkill, and breakfast from bacon grease, they stopped being predictable customers. The FDA called it sanitation risk. The USDA called it quality standards. Corporations called it consumer confusion. But what they all meant was, you're not allowed to feed yourself without us. These meals prove they were wrong, and every time you open a can of sardines or fry a slice of Spam, you're proving it again. These 30 meals weren't recipes. They were courtroom evidence that survival looks ugly when corporations aren't allowed to sanitize it. From 1972 to 1979, American families watched grocery prices double, gas hit $1 a gallon, and unemployment climbed to 9%, and instead of starving quietly, they started cooking things that regulators later called banned. They trapped squirrels, foraged dandelions, slaughtered their own pigs, and made pies from water and sugar. They ate roadkill, raw liver, chicken feet, and beef tongue. Not because they were adventurous eaters, but because those were the only proteins they could afford when hamburger hit $2 a pound and the food stamp office had a 3-week wait list. The FDA, USDA, and state regulators looked at these kitchens and saw chaos. They saw unsanitary home slaughter, unverified wild mushrooms, lead-contaminated dandelions, and prion-risk deer organs. They issued warnings, passed ordinances, and banned sales. But what they really saw was a population that had stopped asking permission to eat. They saw families who didn't need grocery stores, didn't trust meat inspectors, and didn't care what the American Heart Association thought about bacon grease. They saw independence. And independence is the most dangerous ingredient in any kitchen because it can't be recalled, regulated, or repackaged. By 1980, most of these meals had vanished. Roadkill collection was illegal in 43 states. Home slaughter required licenses and inspections. Wild game regulations banned urban trapping, commodity cheese distribution ended, and bologna, sardines, and Spam became punchlines instead of proteins. Corporations won. They turned survival into nostalgia, poverty into irony, and resourcefulness into a food trend you could buy at Whole Foods for $12 a pound. But the families who cooked these meals in 1973, 1974, and 1975 didn't lose. They fed their kids when the system said it was impossible. They proved that you can make dinner from a deer heart, a can of sardines, or 2 cups of water. And they passed that knowledge down to you, even if you've never had to use it yet, because the recession is always coming back. And when it does, you'll remember that banned doesn't mean impossible. It just means they're scared of what you can do without them.